Good morning, everyone. My name is Trish Secca, and I'm a Senior Nutrition Program Manager here at IFINS, the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Science. And we are one of the partners in the Partnership for Public Health for a Global Branded Foods Product Database. IFINS is a nonprofit organization that brings together government, industry, and academia to drive, fund, and lead actionable science in the areas of nutrition and food safety. Today, I had the honor of moderating this webinar called What's in Food? How USDA's Food Data Central and the Global Branded Food Products Database supports nutrition research. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the partnership. The Partnership for Public Health is made up of USDA, IFINS, GS1 US, One World Sync, Nielsen IQ, and the University of Maryland. The goal of the partnership is to improve public health and the sharing of open data by expanding and enhancing the USDA National Nutrient Database, now known as USDA Food Data Central, with nutrition composition and ingredient information on branded foods and private label data provided by the food industry. Our first speaker today from USDA, Kyle McKillop, will share more about the partnership and these companies' contributions to expanding and enhancing the database. Before we get started, I'd like to first cover how to ask questions. So this is the first format that attendees may see on the screen. You'll see there's a orange arrow that allows you to expand or collapse the control panel, and then an area where you can enter questions. Comments and questions entered into the control panel are only visible to IFIN staff, not to other attendees. And we will take a look at these questions during the webinar, and we will leverage them during our Q&A period at the end of the webinar. Some of you might have an older version of GoToWebinar, and you might see this screen. It operates the same way. You can just enter your questions. They're not visible to other attendees, and staff will monitor the questions box during the webinar. This webinar has also been approved for 1.5 Level 2 CEUs by the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and a link will be shared to participants after the webinar to access the survey and the CPEU certificate. So let's get started. Our first speaker today will be Kyle McKillop. Kyle is the lead on USDA's Food Data Central, an integrated data system that provides expanded nutrient profile data and links to related agricultural and experimental research. Kyle has a bachelor's in computer science and a master's in information management with a specialty in technology development and deployment. He previously worked for the University of Maryland's Joint Institute for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, where he worked on developing food database systems, including modernizing USDA's food composition database. Kyle is now with the USDA ARS Beltsville Human Nutrition Research Center, and he leads Food Data Central's data collection efforts and manages future application developments. He's an active participant of the public-private partnership that works to expand global branded foods. Please welcome Kyle McKillop.
Great. Thank you, Trish. And thank you for that introduction. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. Just a quick note that I have no financial disclosures. To start today, I'm going to be doing a very quick overview of Food Data Central for those that might be unfamiliar with the application and of our data types, though the primary goal of this presentation will be doing a deeper dive into the branded foods data type. If you're unfamiliar with Food Data Central, it is an integrated data system that provides expanded nutrient profile data and links to related agricultural and experimental research. It is a publicly accessible website and tool at fdc.nal.usda.gov. You can see this is a screenshot of the front page. You can use our search application to search through our data and explore our 5 different data types, of which branded foods is one. And we really highlight our data accessibility on Food Data Central. First, we have data downloads. These are generated every 6 months in April and October, and they're provided in 2 open source formats, CSV and JSON. We also have an API that's called an application programming interface. That's for those that might be developing apps or those that might have statistical software that can interface with an API that gives them direct link to our data system and our database. It includes additional search capabilities, and it gives access to all of our data, including our monthly branded food data updates. This format is also provided in JSON. We also have extensive data documentation. We have data documents for each of our data types. We have a field description document that documents every field and its definition. And for those that are using the API, we provide a guide on how to get started, as well as to get a data key from USDA's from the federal data.gov for open access to our data set. If you dive into our data, you'll find 5 different data types. And I provided a short definition here, but I implore you to go to Food Data Central and explore the documentation, explore the different tabs and search through our data and read the documentation, read the definitions that come up. I'll sort of highlight here, we have these 5 data types. It's foundation foods, standard reference, food and nutrient database for dietary studies, branded foods, and experimental foods. And each data type is different from one another. They include data that are analytical, calculated, imputed. It includes label data, research data, and includes the application database for FNDDS, which represents generic food profiles. I'm going to very quickly go over 3 of these data types before I delve into branded foods. And Alana is going to be talking more about the food and nutrient database for dietary studies. So to begin with standard reference, those that may be familiar with food composition and the history of food composition may recognize this data set. It does represent over 30 years of food composition analysis at the USDA. It included 65 key nutrients needed for FNDDS. It was compiled through composited samples from across the United States using census data, and ultimately provides good average values for U.S. exposure. Though its final release was in 2018, that data set is no longer updated. And this was due to external factors. The USDA, we needed to change our approach to food analysis because of these factors, such as the rapid increase in the number and variety of foods in the food supply to keep up with the differences in formulation, how people were processing and preparing their food, and the many different types of multi-ingredient foods made it unsustainable to continued standard reference in the approach we were taking. We also were understanding that there are new agricultural practices and new agricultural products that are being introduced every day. And with the advancements of what we know in science, both about nutrition and composition, about what we know about the microbiome and the impact on human health, we wanted to take a different approach in how we were analyzing and providing food composition data, as well as the evolution of analytical approaches about how we discover what's in our foods, and largely driven by 2016's launch of branded foods. To put it in perspective, standard reference database includes about 9,000 records. They're a mix of single ingredient, multi-ingredient, and cooked foods. The branded foods database launched in 2016 with 100,000 records representing a large selection of branded food products in the U.S. food supply. So in 2019, we developed and launched Food Data Central, as well as the new approach to food analysis, foundation foods. Foundation foods are single commodity or single commodity derived, minimally processed foods. We are focused on the building blocks of recipes. We're focused, therefore, on the foundation of recipes and call them foundation foods. These represent individual food samples that are a snapshot in time with expansive metadata provided. They're to represent where they were grown, where they were collected, where we bought them or purchased them from. We include pictures that go over color and size, and we provide all of this metadata and the individual values of analysis for each one of these samples. And all of the data we provide are analytical. They're analyzed in a lab using reproducible and reliable techniques and analyzing not just what we commonly know as nutrients, but other components within our foods. And we hope that the data that we're collecting and providing in an openly accessible format and in a transparent manner are helping inform variability of food on the marketplace, giving a better understanding of the foods that we eat. I could talk about foundation foods all day, but I'll continue on to experimental foods. These are foods that currently are in peer-reviewed published literature and focus on food composition and food composition within the food system. These data contain foods produced, acquired, or studied under unique conditions, alternative management systems, genotypes, research and analytical protocols, just to name a few examples. And these are data that were not collected in the foundation food approach, but are meant to be complementary to foundation foods, meeting those single commodity and single commodity derived, highly consumed foods. The idea being to capture data and high quality food composition data that already exists in the literature, especially those that have collaborated with USDA. This includes both agricultural practices and its impact on food composition. It includes food composition and its impact on health, a much broader approach than just analyzing what's in our foods. And we'll continue to evolve experimental foods and foundation foods as FDC continues to grow. And with that, I'll transition us over into talking and doing a deep dive into USDA's global branded food products database. As Trish mentioned, this is actually a partnership that includes the organizations listed. Trish introduced IFANS. I hope everyone here knows what USDA is, but we're specifically from the Agricultural Research Service, and all of the data that this partnership collects is made available through FoodData Central through the collaboration with the Agricultural Research Service. Also included is GS1 US. GS1 US is part of one of the largest identification and standards organizations in the world, best known as the administrator of the UPC barcode. GS1 US helps organizations uniquely identify products, locations, companies, and then share that information in a consistent way. As a global, neutral, not-for-profit organization, they bring companies of all sizes together to discuss and solve business challenges. The University of Maryland, specifically the Joint Institute for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, GIFSAM, they assist in data management and mapping of our data. It is a center of excellence to promote research, education, and outreach in food safety, security, and applied nutrition. Their goal is to be a premier source of scientific information that enables the development of sound public health policy and reduces the incidence of food-related illness. Nielsen IQ is one of our 2 data pools in which branded food acquires information. Nielsen IQ collects data on food packaging coupled with the understanding of consumer buying behavior. Package images scanned from labels and label flats are digitized and provided forward as an API to University of Maryland. Partnership's other data pool is One World Sync, the world's largest GDSN data pool. GDSN stands for the Global Data Synchronization Network. And as part of the GDSN, manufacturers can manage and submit their product data directly to USDA. One World Sync provides data access to these submissions through an API that again is forwarded to University of Maryland. The partnership as a whole works on outreach efforts and data quality assurance, but every team brings something unique to the table to make sure that this partnership is successful. Now, if you go into branded foods, we do require some specific fields in order to be included in our data set. These include a way to identify the product, which is the Global Trade Item Number, or GTIN. You need to have a description of your brand and product. You need to have the nutrients as shown on the nutrient facts panel to be included in branded foods. An ingredient list, a serving size, and a standardized weight volume, a date stamp with the current formulation, and the market country. Now that the database is global, the market country is the country in which that specific iteration or that specific G10 product is sold and marketed. The database launched in 2016. It was launched by Secretary Vilsack at the GODAN Summit with 100,000 products and has grown every year since, including outreach by FAO InFoods to request for global expansion. Our Food Data Central launched in 2019. We ultimately reached our first international market within the last year, currently representing New Zealand market foods. And we're currently finishing up a pilot with Health Canada to bring Canadian market foods and planning a pilot with Costa Rica in the future to continue our international market approach. But this includes continuing to expand and make available U.S. market data as well. We're currently approaching 500,000 products within our database. And I want to talk some about the data submission pipeline. Manufacturers have two ways that they can provide their data to the USDA database. The first is through the Global Data Synchronization Network, or GDSN, through One World Sync. Manufacturers manage and submit their own data. Many manufacturers are already using GDSN system and have been working to add in nutrient values on their products within the system. They select the USDA to submit these data, and those data are then provided forward. The second is through Nielsen IQ. This data is collected primarily through computer scanning. Images may be label images or label flat images that are digitized by the Nielsen IQ process, capturing the required data for branded foods and then providing that information forward. These two data streams ultimately make their way to University of Maryland, who is responsible for capturing this and aggregating the two systems together. They map fields from the respective data pipelines into the fields that we use for Food Data Central. Mapping occurs to standardize nutrient names and units of measure. They then convert these data to per 100 gram or per 100 milliliter servings as currently required by the Food Data Central system. And University of Maryland submits monthly updates to be disseminated by FDC at the end of every month. Those data providers that update their data by the first of each month will be in the Food Data Central system by the end of each month. I want to talk more about the data you'll find and its quality. To start, there's a bunch of extended data attributes within the branded food system. I highlighted the required attributes, but that's not all there is. These are data points that did not exist when branded foods first launched. The partnership works to identify other informational fields that can be provided forward to increase the quality and the amount of metadata available on each branded product. This includes additional not on package food composition data that might be nutritionally significant. It includes package size for those that are trying to determine nutrients within a package. It includes a caffeine statement that might determine the amount of caffeine per serving or per package. It includes the not a significant source of statement for those products that do not provide a full suite of nutrients, because some of those nutrients might be within the reportable amount. It includes microbial data, which is something just launched recently, that that manufacturers can provide live microbial data amounts at the date of expiration, as well as what those microbial data and what strains of microbes those represent. We included a trade channel for our work with the Food and Nutrition Service, more about that soon. And we have more coming. We are actively pursuing things like multiple language support, as well as multi-column support. Multi-column being a unprepared and prepared state, or potentially products that have multiple different individual items in that package, different suites of nutrients. And the partnership continues to evaluate these data before they're published, and Food Data Central continues to expand its capabilities to allow these new data and new data fields to come through. Another example I want to highlight is through the GDSN. We have an attribute to capture how the supplier has arrived at their nutrient content. This is not typically something you would find on a label. So what manufacturers can provide is the label information and the value They can tell us, was that derived through analysis? Was that derived by calculating it, perhaps using data they found in Foundation Foods or SR, or was it a combination of analytical and calculated values? So we do provide methods in which manufacturers can increase the quality of their data in the Global Branded Food Products database by marking these data points as analytically derived. Another point that I would like to highlight is timestamps. If you use branded foods, you'll find 3 different timestamps on each product. These include the available date, which is when the product record was provided by the data provider to Nielsen IQ and One World Sync, and the modification date, which is the date product data was last modified by the data provider. These first 2 data points are those that are generated by the manufacturer and the data provider. These will dictate when the data provider last modified the record and when they made it available to be accessed. The FTC publication date is one provided and generated by USDA. And this date is to represent when we added and made it available in our monthly updates in the USDA Global Branded Food Product database. It's important to understand these different data types when you're using our data, but they help be transparent about the data that you're seeing and when they might have last been updated. These directly go into the product updates. For many products in our website, there are multiple iterations when you go to the Update Log tab in each one of these products. It notes whenever a change was made during a monthly update, as well as what change occurred. In this example, you can see while this data product was first launched in 2019 when FoodData Central was first made available, there was a food category update when food categories were introduced in December of 2019, and then a nutrient added in 2020, which includes the new labeling regulations on added sugar. So you can see an example of when these data get published through our system and go into each one of these individual records to see the nutrient suite at that time, as well as the additional metadata I've just mentioned and the dates. Data that goes through the branded food products database go through different levels of data quality checks. The first is what we call hard data entry validations. These are strict rules for types of data entered, and when they're not met, further data entry is forbidden. Meaning if they don't meet these hard data entry validations, that data will not make its way to USDA's FoodData Central. These hard data entry validations currently are those required fields, the fields that we dictated must be filled out for inclusion within the branded database. We also have soft data entry validations. Unlike hard data entry validations, the soft validations allow the manufacturer and the data provider to continue to submit the data for publication within USDA and will be published in the USDA monthly update. This will highlight information that is likely incorrect to give the data provider and the manufacturer information on something that might have been entered incorrectly within the system. It does not stop the data from coming through, but it does notify the data provider that they should review the data that they submitted. The partnership is actively reviewing these hard and soft data entry validations that we might move some of these soft data entry validations into the hard validations to stop some of the more suspect data from coming through. But the reality is that food composition is difficult, and what might be a valid hard validation for one product will stop a valid product from coming through. And so the partnership takes that at hand and considers what we can move over to increase the quality while still making sure that data can flow through the system. There's also outliers and profiling performed by every data partner, and it's data that falls outside of a typical product range, and they're flagged for review. These are simple things like nutrients being larger than the serving size that don't make sense and need to be reviewed. And all of this is communicated back. There's also random sampling, in which thousands of products are pulled each month and sampled for data accuracy. Each data provider handles that random sampling differently. We also do random sampling at the USDA and University of Maryland level to just ensure the data that's being submitted is being represented correctly within the USDA. Other data quality items include the currency of data. I've mentioned it a few times, but our data set is updated monthly so that we can try and reflect the most recent submissions by manufacturers. Again, if a manufacturer gets it in by the first of the month, they should see their data within Food Data Central by the end of the month. Manufacturers can send updated product data at any time through product reformulations, and our update log should represent the changes to this product, unless, of course, it's generated a new product code, in which case it'll be a new record and a new product within the data set. And we estimate currently 80% of total U.S. sales volume, I believe it's actually a little bit higher than that, is currently represented within the branded foods data set. Now, I want to talk a little more about those that are interested in using the branded foods data. The first limitation I want to mention is that data submission is voluntary. We do not have a mandate for those to enter the data within the system, and we do rely on manufacturers to be not only submitting their data, but also submitting new products and keeping their data up to date. So a lot of the work the partnership does includes outreach efforts to remind manufacturers to keep their data up to date and to submit new products, as working with Nielsen IQ to identify products that need to be updated and rescanned and provided through the system. That's an active process. Another note is that University of Maryland, as required by the Food Data Central system, is mapped and converted to per 100 gram or per 100 milliliter servings. You can find how this calculation is performed or what calculation is performed by using the derived by field within branded foods. So I recommend going in and seeing if it was derived by the serving size or if it was derived by percent daily value. You can find that in the system. But it's important to understand here that when you're using this data, and because branded foods currently stores data by per 100 gram, that rounding errors can happen when you try to convert back to the per serving information. So data may not be entirely as submitted by serving. And this is a problem the partnership and Food Data Central is exploring about how we might be able to provide the data more accurately in the per serving amount. But actively is not available right now within the Food Data Central system. The next is to note that label data are subject to FDA food labeling requirements. This is the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act for those that want to do further research. This dictates how the company must come to their food label, what techniques they are allowed to use, and what percent error is allowed on the label. And I suggest those that are using the data within our system have somewhat of an understanding of these FDA food labeling requirements to have a better understanding of the data that's being provided. I really want to highlight labeling complexity. If you get started down the rabbit hole of reading through the FDA labeling requirements, there are a lot of caveats in the data. Some data and some products don't require nutrient fact panels, and those sorts of products are not currently available within branded foods because they lack nutrients that are currently required by our system. And so all of these sort of edge cases are consistently reviewed by the data managers in our system, as well as the partnership as a whole, to identify when and if these foods should be made through and how we might make them available in the future. There are small caveats for different types of foods on whether they're allowed to have added sugars or not. So coming up with strict rules to work on the data quality guidelines is very difficult. Added to the fact of our global expansion, each country defines and manages nutrients differently. If you're reading in the nutrient fact panel from a different country, it's important to also look at that country's labeling requirements to get a better understanding of that data. If you're going to use branded foods, I recommend a few things. The first is the field G10 UPC identifies each unique product. The field FDC ID identifies each separate database record iteration of that unique product. On my next slide, I'll sort of highlight, excuse me, I'm going to go back real quick. I apologize. You'll see here in the instance, this one product has one specific G10 UPC, though it has a different FDC ID for every iteration and update of that. You should also consider timestamps for reviewing and selecting data. I provided you information on how to review and use these, and I recommend you look and when you're using this to understand specifically modification date to get an understanding of when the manufacturer last touched and updated that record. And last, make sure you read the documentation. The documentation is very important to understanding some of these caveats on how to use the data successfully for whatever research or data need that you might have. And lastly, I'm going to get into branded food data usage. So I'm going to highlight some specific collaborations within other agencies within USDA or multiple agencies within USDA to show the impact that branded foods has already had for USDA and ultimately the entire federal government. So to start with USDA, I'll first mention real quickly with the Agricultural Research Service, the informing of nutrient composition data as a part of food and nutrient database for dietary studies. Again, Alana will be talking specifically about this impact in the next presentation. I want to highlight the USDA Food and Nutrition Service. There are two different projects in which we support their needs. The first is through the Child Nutrition Database, in which we increase the visibility of child food products and self-identified products for the inclusion of the yearly release of the Child Nutrition Database. Those that use the GDSN can use that trade channel feature that I mentioned before to mark their product as a child nutrition program product so that FNS can identify that product in their yearly release of the Child Nutrition Database. The Child Nutrition Database is used by dietitians in the cafeterias to help menu plan, and that data is vital for making sure that those menus can be planned with the correct dietary requirements of the students. The second is there is a separate data pipeline that supports USDA Foods data submission for the National School Lunch Program. So this utilizes the partnership and utilizes the people in the partnership, including One World Sync, GS1, and University of Maryland, to provide information for the National School Lunch Program. Unlike the branded foods database, this pipeline is actually mandated by FNS and AMS for those that want to submit data over to the USDA. It includes additional information such as allergen information that's required by USDA Foods and helps those companies that need to meet the requirement of reporting their data for the National School Lunch Program. We also have a collaboration with the Economic Research Service, which links nutrient and ingredient information to data on household food purchases and acquisitions collected as part of their National Household Food Acquisition and Purchase Survey, also called Food Apps. This allows ERS to have a better understanding of the actual purchase of nutrients and available nutrients within the pantry at home. But USDA is not the only one that's using this data. We're seeing data usage from a lot of different types of users. This might be the research community, policy officials, public health community, food industry, and consumers. It includes people globally. Food Data Central reaches about 50% of its audience, includes those users who are not in the US. So 50% of users are outside of US for Food Data Central. And so we see a lot of international support of this data set and these databases as well. We've seen the Global Branded Food Products Database be used to access ingredients within product categories. This helps even Food Data Central and Foundation Foods have a better understanding of the foods in the food supply and highly consumed and highly used ingredients. We've seen it used to establish links between diet and chronic disease to get a better understanding of things like sodium monitoring and tracking to understand how products are changing food supply. It helps inform dietary tracking software and apps. I want to highlight this is a free, publicly accessible application, and as such, is a very valuable tool for those that are creating dietary tracking apps and want to have a better way for their users to be able to find and include branded products within their dietary tracking. And it helps support federal programs and surveys to inform food and nutrient assistance policy. Again, FNDDS and the Food Surveys Research Group is just one example of this that Alana will show. But there are other programs that do surveys and try to be better informed about nutrient intake. We're also seeing a growing use of machine learning to predict label nutrients or even suggest food categorization in publications that are actually coming out of BHNRC to suggest how the ingredient list and the description of the food might help categorize that food if that category is not already provided. This sort of information will be important when in the future, as those who are generating recipes might want to know where their recipe falls within a food category. With that, I want to mention that Food Data Central is actually a collective effort. For the Food Data Central side, we highly recommend, if you have a question, to use the Food Data Central contact form at ftc.nal.usda.gov /contact.html. This information gets triaged to us, and we can collect. And also, if you have a question about a specific branded food or you notice an error within the system, it's a way to reach out to us for us to use our data and our partnership to give back feedback to the partnership, as well as review any data quality issues that someone may have discovered. The database itself, the full application, has a principals team that help oversight it, and I have my own Food Data Central team that helps manage this data as we publish through. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me as well. Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyle. And as anticipated, there was a significant amount of engagement during your presentation. Lots of questions that we will be answering at the end of the webinar. I'll just note that because the focus of the webinar is on global branded foods, we will attempt to get those questions answered first, and then address some of the additional questions about some of the other Food Data Central databases. So time to introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Alana Moshfegh. Alana is Research Leader, Food Surveys Research Group, Beltsville Human Nutrition Research Center at USDA. There she leads a staff of nutritionists, food technologists, and statisticians in planning and directing a national program of research in monitoring food composition behavior and assessing the nutritional adequacy of American diets. Ms. Moshfegh is responsible for directing What We Eat in America, the dietary interview component of NHANES. She also oversees data preparation for public release, statistical reports, research papers, enhancements to collection methodology, and develops nutrient databases of foods commonly consumed. She directed the development and validation of USDA's automated multiple pass method, AMPM, a 5-step 24-hour dietary recall used in What We Eat in America and in research studies in the U.S. and internationally. Alana has established and participated in collaborations with more than 30 studies, research organizations, and foreign governments regarding dietary data collection. She's a registered dietitian with an MS in nutrition and food service management from the University of Nebraska and her BS in nutrition and dietetics from North Dakota State University. Please welcome Alana.
Thank you, Trish. I want to thank IFANS for sponsoring this webinar so we can have a chance to talk about what we at the Beltsville Human Nutrition Research Center love, food composition. So in my time today, I'm going to talk about one of the data types that sits within FoodData Central, the Food and Nutrient Database for Dietary Studies. Like all of the data types in FDC, it is very unique. So we're one of the data types, but it's built on composition data that sits in FDC from Foundation Foods, SR Legacy, as well as informing us from the branded foods database. So I'm going to do an overview briefly of FNDDS and how it uses those three other data types from FDC, and then follow up with some tips and an example of how we went in and used branded foods to help us look at and inform what we're planning to do with the latest version that we're working on right now of FNDDS. So let me show that I have no financial disclosures. And start in with a little background about the Food and Nutrient Database for Dietary Studies. It's one of two pillars for national dietary surveillance in the United States. That's part of What We Eat in America, the dietary intake portion of NHANES. So one of those pillars is the 24-hour dietary recall method that's used within NHANES, that's developed by the Food Surveys Research Group here at USDA, the Automated Multiple Pass. And the other pillar is the Food and Nutrient Database for Dietary Studies. FNDDS is developed solely for the use of What We Eat in America to characterize the foods and beverages that are reported in the survey for their nutrient values for energy and 64 nutrients. So FNDDS contains all of the foods and beverages reported in the survey on an as-consumed basis. It has extensive detail on the gram weights for the various portions that are reported for these foods, as well as then the nutrient profiles. So it not only serves that information, but it also is a gateway for understanding additional information about the reported foods and beverages from the survey. A new version of FNDDS is developed and released publicly for each 2-year cycle of What We Eat in America and NHANES. And that's because there's new data on composition of foods that are incorporated into FNDDS, as well as new types of foods that are added to FNDDS and changes to the prior version of FNDDS where foods are codes are discontinued. This next slide shows you the three most recent versions of FNDDS for 2015-16, 2017-18, and the most recent, the 10th version of FNDDS, 2019 through 2020. And you can see the number of codes have decreased over these three versions. We've added new foods. We've also discontinued a number of codes. So that's the importance of being sure when you're analyzing data from What We Eat in America and you want to know more detail about the foods that you're looking at, the particular FNDDS version that goes with the 2-year cycle of the What We Eat in America. Now, let's get into building FNDDS using our data that's in FoodData Central. I'm going to view my next several remarks and slides based on the most current version of the 2019-2020 FNDDS. We use just under 1,900 foods from FoodData Central to build and populate the profiles of the 5,624 food and beverages that are in FNDDS. About a third of those codes are matched to one specific FDC code, but 2/3 are matched to 2 or more FDC codes. When we're matching to 2 or more FDC codes, we use a recipe calculation process. Briefly, we select each ingredient and their amount in an FNDDS food. We apply factors for nutrient losses or moisture adjustment, if appropriate, to each individual ingredients, and then we sum the resulting nutrient values for all the ingredients to give us a nutrient profile. For FNDDS, as part of one of the data types within FDC, it's important to remember that the nutrient profiles in FNDDS are as consumed and designed to represent not an exacting product, but multiple variants of a food or beverage. Unlike foundation foods in FoodData Central, that's representing an exacting, minimally processed ingredient. This data in FNDDS is quite different, so it's important to understand these data types. The ingredients and the amounts to create a nutrient profile are selected specific to get to the nutrient profile. They're in FNDDS. They're not exact ingredients that you would find in the products. They're selected to get to a nutrient profile. They're primarily the main ingredients. They're not those with minimal nutrient content, such as spices. So these recipes aren't really recipes you would use in your kitchen for making an item. The sources used to determine what should be the ingredients and their amounts. Well, we use the Branded Foods database to look at what are ingredients that are in commercial products. So if we're making up a recipe for something, what are the major ingredients we should be considering? We also go to food industry websites and a variety of cookbooks and recipe websites as well. This graph represents the ingredient codes that are used across these 3 different versions of FNDDS from FDC. So the bottom bar shows all of the ingredients that were used to build FNDDS were from standard reference. This was prior to release and launching of FoodData Central. But for our 2017-2018 FNDDS, we began to move to foundation foods. And with 1920 FNDDS, we have 113 foundation foods that are used. And you can see we've decreased our use of SR by about 1/3 over these 3 cycles. So as more and more foods are added into foundation foods, we will be capitalizing and using those because they're the more current analytical data for basic ingredients. Now, this gives you a sampling of the 113 foundation foods we used in FNDDS for 1920. at the time, or FDC 6.0, there were 160 total foundation foods. We used about 70% of them in building FNDDS, and this shows you the 3 examples. For apples, we used the 5 different apple types that sit in foundation foods. So when you look at a raw apple in FNDDS, we represent that raw apple by each of these 5 different types of apples. 20% of the profile for each of these different types make up the nutrient profile for a raw apple, for example. For bananas, there's 2 foundation foods for bananas. One is ripe and slightly ripe, and one is overripe. When you go into FNDDS or raw bananas, you'll see 90% of the ripe and slightly ripe foundation food is used, and 10% of the overripe. On the right side, you can see there's 9 different foundation foods for eggs. And we've used 4 of those as we've built recipes in FNDDS for 1920. Now, going back to one of the particular apples that's in foundation foods, this one happens to be Gala apples. I've highlighted here the richness of foundation food data. Primarily, we use the average amount for all of the nutrients that are provided, which you see by the arrow there, and you look down and can see the values. On the right-hand side, where I've got a box, it gives a number of samples that were analyzed of Gala apples for coming up with these nutrient profiles. You get the minimum value, the maximum value across the 8 samples, as well as the median value. So you can look across these data to get a real depth and wealth of the composition values that this information has in foundation foods. And we find that particularly helpful as we're looking at and selecting the data for using and building FNDDS. Now, there's also some challenges. So within foundation foods, it targets the important nutrients in the food, not necessarily all the nutrients we need in FNDDS, which reports out energy and 64 nutrients. So we select values. We base our selection value based on the total reported value for the nutrients. But we do have to make some determinations for values that foundation foods does not provide. For example, here I've given you 3 examples. For added vitamin B12, which we report out in FNDDS, as well as added vitamin E, we assume that amount based on the total B12 and the total vitamin E that's in foundation foods. Foundation foods reports out only total folate. So we have to make assumptions for folic acid, food folate, as well as the dietary folate equivalents. Now, in the documentation for FNDDS, we go into detail about the assumptions that we have to make when foundation foods does not provide those values. So let's take a look at these 113 foundation foods in FNDDS for 1920. So about half of the nutrient values of these 113 foundation foods are truly foundation foods nutrient values. That means about the other half, or 55%, we have to find and determine what are going to be the values to make up that full profile, because FNDDS for every food has a value for every nutrient. There's no missing values. About half of those, or a quarter, are matched to an SR nutrient value for the same food. For about another quarter of those, we match to either a similar foundation food value or a similar SR food value. And then about 10% of the values we have to calculate or assume a zero. All of this detail for the source of each of the nutrient values for our FNDDS items are detailed on our data files and the documentation for each of the versions of FNDDS. We also have to make decisions for the choice of measurement for a nutrient value. And I want to give a couple examples here. For foundation foods, energy is given both in generic and specific Atwater factors. We use the Atwater general factors for our FNDDS foods because they're general representations of a food. So here I've gone back to the example in foundation foods for Gala apples, and you can see both the general factors and what the calorie calculation is, as well as the specific factors. And the calorie calculation is slightly less. And here you can see the general and specific factors where it's given for apples. For the general factors, it's 494. And that's what we use across all of the energy factors from foundation foods for those that we use in FNDDS. Now, I showed you where you can look at sample values, the min, the max, and the median, in addition to the average values. And so we took advantage of that for the standardization of vitamin D level across milks in building FNDDS for 1920. Here you can see the vitamin D3 value for whole milk, the average value, was slightly less than for the other fat levels of milk. So we looked at the median values and decided to use the median value for vitamin D3 for whole milk. So those values for vitamin D3 were more standardized across the milks. So that's the depth of the richness of the values that sit in foundation foods, where a user can go in and look and make those determinations. Now, this is the website for the Food Surveys Research Group. You can also get FNDDS from downloading on FoodData Central, but as well you can go to the FSRG website and get extensive detail on how FNDDS has been built. And so you can see here the documentation as well as the databases on the blue bar on the top. And I've highlighted for you on the left side of this slide some examples of things I think you should pay attention to. I've mentioned the detailed documentation of how FNDDS is built, and that's where you can find it. FNDDS is accessible both in Access and SAS, but we've also put most of the data values across 5 different Excel files, and that you'll see that I've got highlighted here. And I've highlighted one, the ingredient nutrient values Excel file, which provides the source of each nutrient value for each of the 1,800 plus FDC ingredients that we use. So it's complete transparency of where we've got that nutrient value. And then, of course, as you go down below the resources section, we've downloaded the FDC version 6 that we use for building FNDDS for 1920. So this place on the FSRG website is kind of a one-stop shopping place, if you will, to see all of the resources and the links for what we use as we build FNDDS. So you see the FDC data set. We dipped in and got a few handful of values from SR28. So that sits there. Our food yields at different stages of preparation. So you can look at moisture and loss adjustments that we use. That resource, Ag Handbook number 102, as well as USDA's table for nutrient retention factors that we used, depending on the source of the food, if it was raw and it was a cooked product. Now, I want to turn to the example of how we're using branded foods data specifically to inform our work as we're moving forward for the next version of FNDDS for 21 through 23. Looking at the sodium levels in turkey and ham deli meats. These are the two most popular deli meats that get reported in FNDDS. And the values for those are about from data from 7 to 8 years ago, released on SR websites. So, of course, with all of the recommendations for looking at and lowering sodium levels in food products, as well as, of course, all of us to lower the sodium intakes that we're consuming, we wanted to look specifically at branded foods across the 21 through 23 time frame for these two very specific products and see if we could look at and see, is sodium levels changing for these particular products? So let me walk you through broadly what we did and hope that this will give you an idea of, if you've not gone in and delved into branded foods, how you could get a start on doing this. So as Kyle mentioned, there's nearly 500,000 branded food records that sit in the branded foods data type in FDC. We took those and narrowed them down to what we wanted to look at, turkey and ham deli meats, and got to about 350 unique G10 UPC codes. So let me walk you through how we did that. So of course, first we went to FoodData Central, downloaded the data. When you click into FoodData Central, you'll see download data with on the top of the screen, as well as a second place where you can download the data. So that's the first thing you do. When you click on that, it's going to take you to a number of pages that are very, very valuable for looking at this kind of data. So I've highlighted here, this is a clip right from the download page and what it's going to look like. And I highlighted the branded foods data. Now, go to the right and look at the size of these files. Under branded, looking at the CSV file, it's 2.4 gigs. It's very, very large. At the next level below, the full download of all data types in branded foods is 2.6 gigs. So you can see branded foods takes up the majority of the data that sit in FoodData Central. So here's some tips as we went in to do that. Of course, file size, as I've said, is very large. Um, you can't put it into Excel because it's too large. Excel won't hold it. So you need a software that will hold something this large, SAS or R, to view and start to use the data. Kyle talked about the importance of reading the documentation, which this page, the download page, will show you where that is. It's documentation for each data type. It's always so much more fun to just delve into the data and look at it. But it's really important to read that documentation and understand what is in the data and how it's structured, because this will give you tips for how to look at the data. So branded data has 11 files with 72 fields. I think there's 36 files across FoodData Central, and Kyle told me there's just a little under 165 fields that describe all of the definitions of the terms and the labels when you download those files. And so there's a number of pieces that can help you to understand what you're going to get when you download that data. So you've downloaded the data like we did. Now you need to select the needed data to answer the question or what you're looking for by the appropriate ID fields. And Kyle talked about those fields as well. Now, just note that for highly skilled data users, there's also JSON download as well as the API guide that's provided. And that's all in that download pages, actually, when you get there, so you can find it. So now let's walk through a little bit about what we did. Downloaded the data. We looked at these food categories that Kyle talked about had, since branded foods had started, have been added in as a data feature. There's just under 400 branded food categories, and that's one of the fields that are in branded foods. So we looked across those 390 and came up with 5 categories where we thought, well, deli meats are probably going to focus on these 5. So we did that, and that yielded still a large number of food records, about 25,000 plus. So then we needed to fine-tune our selection, and we did that using keywords within the descriptions of the foods, as well as the dates. And Kyle talked to you today about paying attention to those dates. So we included, obviously, the terms turkey and ham, because those were the 2 types of products we were interested in. And we excluded a number of other terms that sit in the descriptions of products within these 5 category types. And you can see them. Now, you're saying we excluded sodium because we didn't want low sodium deli meats for these 2 types. We already have codes for low sodium. We were particularly interested in looking at typical turkey and ham deli meats. We also excluded weights that were over 60 grams because those probably weren't prepackaged deli meats. And these are just a few of the kinds of things that were excluded out. We also excluded historic product versions via excluding out duplicate G10 UPC codes, because as Kyle talked about, showing the example of the Campbell's product, there were 3 different versions, but it was the same product, but changes that had gone on to that product. And we kept codes based on a modified or a publication date between the years we were specifically looking at to inform FNDDS, and that was 2021 to 2023. And that gave us about 350 unique codes for turkey and ham deli meats to help us begin to inform what we should do with the sodium values for these two types of products within 21-23. So we downloaded the entire branded foods database. We selected foods based on categories, include and exclude terms, and those critical publication dates. And that yielded 350 unique records. About half of them are deli turkey and half of them are deli ham. And we're reviewing those now for the sodium label values. So it can inform us as to what we should do with our sodium levels for these two types of products in 21 through 23 FNDDS. Now, of course, the branded foods data represents what's on the food label. So, and again, like I said, these are foods as consumed. We don't match exact products. So you, as when FNDDS 21 through 23 comes out, you'll see what we ended up with the sodium levels for these two types of products. And we'll be discussing how we got to this in the FNDDS documentation. So it's always important to read the documentation, not only for FNDDS, but these other data types if you're going to use them and understand them. So this slide sort of gives what I think of as the hallmarks or the standards of FNDDS. Of course, it exists just to support the AMPM and National Dietary Surveillance. It's transparent and publicly available, not only on FDC, but the FSRG website. And I think a highlight is that it's based on current and quality FDC, particularly new analytical composition values. So thank you for spending your afternoon letting us talk to you about food composition. I want to acknowledge our two lead staff nutritionists at FSRG, who really are the brains and the work behind building FNDDS, and that's Suzanne Morton and Donna Rhodes. And Suzanne is particularly the one who pulled out the data from branded foods to determine what we were going to look at for those particular examples. So she really is our expert in helping us do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alana. I know that the attendees have been very, very engaged during both of your presentations, and we have a lot of questions. So I'm glad we have just about 12 or 15 minutes to answer some of these questions. So I think I'm just going to get right in. I'll start with the questions for Kyle, some very specific questions about the Global Branded Foods Product Database. So one of our first questions was related to coverage. So how much of the food supply is available in the database, Kyle?
Sure. So our understanding, because we have the relationship with Nielsen IQ, that we have about 80 to 85% of the market and market sales volume. What that represents is, as we understand it, there's about an 80%, 20% split, which means we have 80% of the market, which represents 20% of the products that are available on the market. We represent the highest consumed and highest purchased branded foods, but the market is incredibly large, and therefore there's no way for us to be capturing everything, especially in a voluntary data submission database. But I do believe having that high of a volume in our data set for the market sales does more accurately represent what's available in the food supply and the intake of nutrients from U.S. consumers.
So just to clarify, Nielsen matches the data in global branded foods to their sales data to come up with that 85% coverage of food sold. So that means it does represent the highest volume products in the marketplace.
Correct, yes.
Okay, great. And then there was a question related to, similar to that question, is are food manufacturers encouraged to submit their information? What are the benefits to manufacturers to do this? I mean, there was another question about whether USDA determines the food in there, but we've already answered that this is voluntary submission from manufacturers. So this attendee wants to know how are we encouraging manufacturers to participate?
Sure. It's one of the value of having the public-private partnership is we have a representation not only from the public sector, but the private sector, having an understanding of consumer needs, having understanding of manufacturing needs when it comes to data, and a lot of conversations that happened many years prior to the launch in 2016 to have a better understanding of how we were going to get engagement involvement into this data set. And it is a continuing active and an ongoing involvement. We take advantage of the fact that consumers want to have access to this data, other consumer driven initiatives to have a better understanding of what's in their foods, and manufacturers trying to meet these consumer needs by making these data available. I think as this and online grocers continue to grow and better understanding of data practices in there, that our data set will just continue to grow and have more up-to-date and available information on branded products as we go. I see that's the market's been going.
Okay, so the partnership is actively engaged in communicating about the database and encouraging manufacturers to participate.
Absolutely. And working with others in mapping this data, understanding where our data gaps are, and engaging with those data gaps, whether they be individual manufacturers or whether they be a group of products, to understand the limitations of why that data is not in the system and seeing how we can overcome them and make that data publicly accessible.
Okay, great. I'm going to jump to Alana for a second and then come back because this is related. A lot of this question is for you. Is there a way to link the FNDDS with the branded food database?
We don't have in FSRG a linkage for that, but I know our colleagues at the Economic Research Service have done a number of linkages with branded foods data to FNDDS through the Food App study. So
Okay.
I'd encourage people to go to the Economic Research Service website at USDA and search on the Food App study.
Okay. There was one other question on food apps, so I might as well ask that now. Is ERS food apps data available by state or country? Or county, I guess they're saying. And you might not know that, so we could pass that along to food apps.
I don't know that. I don't know if the study was large enough to be representative. So you'd have to check the site.
Yeah, and it's an evolving platform. I believe they've been developing food apps too, or the successor to food apps as well. But the best contact point would be reaching out to ERS.
Okay, great. And then there were a couple other very specific questions about global branded foods. So there was a question about asking to clarify serving size. Somebody mentioned that they looked at entries online. They can see nutrients by 100 grams or by serving size, for example, a half cup of green beans. So they wanted to know if nutrients per serving size is only available online, or are nutrients by serving size available in the downloadable data set for some foods, but not all of them? Can you clarify?
That's a great question. So we store everything in per 100 grams. So when you're using the application, what it's doing is taking that serving size, for example, 1/2 cup or other information, is that there's a gram weight associated with that serving size, with that 1/2 a cup, for example. And so what we do is we take the 100 gram and we convert back by using the gram amount from the serving size to present that data on the application. So it's converted live and presented forward. So if you download the data, you'll see the data presented in 100 gram or per 100 milliliter. But the serving size information is also available. So you'll see that 1/2 cup and you'll see the gram equivalent for that 1/2 cup so that you can do that conversion yourself.
Okay, great. There's also a question about data from labels showing insignificant values, and how is that information captured in branded products?
Yeah, so there's two mechanisms. So I'll remind you that we have two different data pool providers. So in the case of the GDSN today, and we're evaluating this, it's required to enter every mandatory nutrient. So if it's not a significant source, the manufacturer puts that value as 0 or 0% DB into the field when it's submitted. That's not the case for label scanning because that nutrient's not listed at all. So we capture the not a significant source of claim that will capture when those nutrients were below significance as a sort of backup to why those nutrients values are not available.
And the not a significant source statement is a field available in branded foods.
Yes, that's correct.
Great. Okay, so couple more. Someone asked about updates for the USDA regulated foods, meat, poultry, eggs, to report the 2016 label nutrients soon. So I don't know if that's particularly a question for branded foods. So we know that FDA's new label rules were implemented, and all of the FDA products, new labels are available in the marketplace today. All those deadlines have passed for vitamin D, added sugars, all of that. So then the question is USDA foods showing those values. So maybe this is a question for both branded foods and for foundation foods.
Yeah, so foundation foods, of course, we're collecting the most up-to-date nutrient analysis on these products. And if they have questions about foundation foods and what we're analyzing, feel free to reach out to us on the contact form so we can address each question individually. In the case of USDA foods, that's part of that second FNS platform that I mentioned. It's a separate data pipeline, but the benefit of those that are using that mandated process through the school lunch program is that they're already providing all of the requirements to be accessible in our branded foods pipeline as well. So we have outreach efforts to let those companies know if they're submitting data in USDA foods to just go in and check an additional flag to have it sent forward to branded foods available so that we can make those USDA foods and other food service items available through branded foods.
Great, that's fantastic. And because we have such a wonderful interactive platform, I just want to say that Elena Page from ERS has answered the Food Apps question. She says, Food Apps is nationally representative. We do not have state level or county level estimates. So thank you very much for those answers. So let's go to a couple of questions for Alana. Alana, there was a question about what nutrition database do you use to create recipes for FNDDS? Is that Genesis?
No, we don't use a database. We look at foods that sit in branded foods and what are the ingredients there. We go to company websites and see what makes up the products there, what ingredients are in the products there, as well as recipe books and recipe websites. to determine what are the primary ingredients in a particular product. And then we start with that, work on the amounts as well, and then to reach a particular nutrient profile.
Okay. And then there was a question about why is FNDDS developed using SR28 instead of using SR Legacy?
It does use SR Legacy. I mentioned SR28. We use it for just a handful of nutrient values that we need to dip back into because they're not in foundation foods and not appropriate from SR Legacy or in SR Legacy. And if you go to the documentation, you'll see exactly when we used SR28, the very few times that we did. The majority is from the slide I showed, the green bar being SR Legacy and the blue bar being foundation.
Okay, awesome. We'll go back to a question for Kyle. For the expanded data attributes, since this data is voluntary, wait, I'm losing, there's so many questions. Since this data is voluntary, how is the partnership encouraging manufacturers to share this information, and how many or what percentage of manufacturers are actually providing voluntary attributes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in some cases, those extended attributes can be found on pack. So in many cases, they're just accessible already through the image scanning and provided from those manufacturers. But for some of the new fields like microbes, I might actually ask our host, Trish, do you want to mention the microbe data and how we sort of got that added? But the reality is it's a new data field. So we have to promote that new data field exists and that new field can be used, and promote how it's going to help the science community better understand our foods.
You put me on the spot, but that's fine. Yes, there are a couple of new fields. Strain for bacterial strains for yogurt and fermented products. There are a few manufacturers sharing that data, but you are correct. It's important that platforms like this webinar and other outreach efforts directly with manufacturers of yogurts, kombucha, and other fermented foods, for us to let them know that those data fields are available. And if that data is available on a label, we are able to now capture it in branded foods. So the use of those fields in the future will rely on more manufacturers sharing that data for it to be available. I think we have time for one more question, and this is an important one since there is so much engagement and questions coming in. Is there a way to get regular updates on global branded foods, like a listserv or something that will let users and other interested parties know when there are updates or when new fields are added, etc.?
Absolutely. So if you go to the Food Data Central website, I'm pulling it up myself right now just to see where it is. Along the left side, you'll see a inventory and update log link. It's right below the description of Food Data Central on the front page. If you click on that inventory and update log, it manages every update that we make to the database, including when those monthly updates go out for branded foods. So if you just see a version increase and a monthly branded food update in addition and a date, that just means we added and updated new products on branded foods. However, if we change a field or add a field, we go into more description and provide bullet points on what changes and what new fields have been added.
Okay, great. Well, that's all the time that we have today. I do want to mention that if you have any questions or any of the questions, we have captured all of the questions that were put into the chat during the presentations, and I will share those questions with our presenters so that they can choose to address them directly with attendees. if they choose to. In addition, you can send questions directly to me at the email that you see on your screen, tzecca@ifins.org. You can also learn more about the partnership by visiting the IFINS website or Food Data Central directly to get more information about that. Or I'm happy to pass on your questions. So I really want to thank Kyle and Alana for such a comprehensive presentation, and for all of our attendees for sticking with us. Really very interesting data, and I'm excited to see where the database goes from here on out. So thank you so much, and to all our attendees, have a great rest of your day.